Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It started with a laugh. Not mine, of course. It came from across the backyard, where the folding chairs were already half filled with cousins I hadn't seen in years and probably wouldn't miss if I never saw them again. The air was thick with grilled hot dogs and fake smiles, and there she was, Emily, my cousin with the perfect teeth and perfectly curated life, standing with a plastic cup of lemonade in her French manicured hand. I had barely stepped off the back porch before she turned to me with that familiar tilt of her head and said it, loud enough for the nearby ants to hear but soft enough to feign innocence. "So," she said with her lips curled into a smirk, "still working that low-paying job?" I hadn't even spoken a word yet. Before I could respond, my mother chuckled, an all-too-familiar sound that had always carried more sting than warmth. She didn't even look at me when she said it, just kept stirring her iced tea like this conversation was nothing but background noise. "We always knew she'd be the disappointment," she said, like I wasn't standing right there, like I wasn't flesh and blood, like I wasn't someone who used to cry herself to sleep wondering what I had done to deserve being the family's punchline. I smiled. Not out of politeness. Not because I was trying to keep the peace. I smiled because I knew something they didn't. Something they'd never see coming. But I said nothing. Just a simple nod, the kind you give when someone's just confirmed what you already knew about them. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to correct them. Not yet. You see, when that invitation showed up in my mailbox a month ago, folded in half and slightly stained with something greasy like a leftover memory, I almost tossed it straight in the trash. Why would I go back there? Why would I willingly walk into the lion's den just to be torn apart for the 100th time? But something stopped me. A whisper in the back of my head that said, "Go. Just once more. Let them talk." I remember standing at my kitchen counter, holding the card between my fingers like it might burn me if I gripped it too tightly. The RSVP box stared back at me, yes or no, and for a moment I hesitated. I didn't want their approval. I didn't crave it like I used to when I was younger, desperate for a scrap of praise from a mother who measured love in achievements and job titles. But I did want something. Closure, maybe. Or something colder. I didn't just wake up one day successful. It wasn't some overnight fairy tale. It was years of grinding through jobs that barely paid rent, of sleepless nights building something from nothing, of being underestimated by people who thought they knew me simply because they shared my last name. And through it all, I never said a damn thing to them. I let them think I was struggling. I let them laugh behind my back. I let them write their little family narratives where I played the fool. So yes, I said yes to the reunion. I even circled it on my calendar like it was an event I was looking forward to, because I knew I wasn't walking in as the same girl they remembered. I wasn't the one scrubbing dishes in a diner or begging for a promotion in an office that smelled like desperation and cheap coffee. I was different now, but I didn't want to show them that with words. I wanted the moment to speak for itself. I walked around that backyard slowly, greeting a few of the older relatives with a nod, dodging the smaller kids darting between picnic tables, catching snippets of gossip and overcooked family stories that hadn't changed in decades. No one paid much attention to me, at least not yet. That was always the thing with my family. They only noticed you when you made a mistake or did something worth mocking. But the moment was coming. I could feel it in the air, like thunder just before a storm, the hush right before the lightning hits. My phone buzzed in my back pocket. I pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and smiled again, this time for real. The message was simple. Just 4 words. But they were everything. Touchdown. We're outside now. I used to think that maybe if I just tried hard enough, if I worked harder or smiled wider or shrank myself into something more convenient, maybe they'd finally stop looking at me like I was the punchline to some long-running family joke. But no matter what I did or how much I tried to fit into the box they carved out for me, I was always the disappointment, always the odd one out, the one they rolled their eyes at, the one they laughed about when they thought I couldn't hear. It started when we were kids, before I even knew what shame tasted like, but somehow they fed it to me in tiny spoonfuls until I learned to swallow it without flinching. My cousin Emily was always the golden girl, the perfect prototype of what everyone thought a daughter should be: straight A report cards, piano recitals, prom queen, and college acceptance letters stacked like trophies on the mantle. She wore success like a second skin, and she flaunted it with this practiced grace that made it impossible for anyone to ignore her. She didn't just shine, she made sure her light cast a shadow over everyone else, especially me. When I got AB on my math test, Emily had already aced calculus 2 years early. When I joined the school play as a background character, Emily was giving valedictorian speeches with tears in her eyes and standing ovations echoing through the gymnasium. And it wasn't just Emily, it was my mother too, always holding her up like some mirror I was supposed to compare myself to. "Why can't you be more like Emily?" she'd say with a sigh so heavy it could crush bone. "She's going places. She's making something of herself." As if I was some half-finished puzzle missing all the important pieces. And if I tried to tell her I had different dreams, different goals, she'd just wave me off like I was speaking another language, one she had no interest in translating. I still remember my first job, waitressing at a roadside diner just off the highway, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and hopelessness. I was proud, though. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I paid my own rent, covered my own bills, scraped by with enough to keep the lights on and ramen on the stove. But when I told my mother, she laughed, not the kind of laugh that bubbles from joy, but the sharp, mean kind that stings in places you didn't know could bruise. "That's what you're proud of," she said, shaking her head like I had confessed to a felony instead of honest work. "Serving greasy food to truckers while your cousin's interning for a senator?" And just like that, my pride crumbled. Emily never wasted a second reminding me of where I stood in the pecking order either. Every family gathering was a performance for her, her newest award, her latest accolade, her next brilliant plan. I'd sit quietly in the corner while she regaled everyone with stories from her glamorous life, tossing me glances laced with pity and superiority. Sometimes she'd ask me things like, "Still living in that tiny apartment?" Or, "Are you still trying to figure out what you want to do with your life?" As if my struggle was entertainment, a reality show she could watch with popcorn. And every time I tried to share something, anything, it was met with polite smiles and quick dismissals. I once told them about a small freelance gig I landed, something I'd worked hard to get, and my uncle actually snorted mid-sentence and muttered, "Well, I guess someone has to do those jobs." Like my work was a joke, a footnote in their narrative of success. It didn't matter how much effort I put in, how long I stayed up working, or how hard I fought to keep going when everything around me screamed failure. To them, I was always the joke, the screw-up, the afterthought. But something changed in me. Maybe it was all those years of being overlooked. Maybe it was the silence that followed their laughter, the way it echoed in my head long after the parties ended and the lights went out. Maybe it was just pure stubbornness. But somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to impress them. I stopped trying to be Emily's shadow or my mother's ideal daughter. I started building something in the quiet, in the spaces they never bothered to look. It was messy and slow and full of missteps, but it was mine. Every failure taught me something. Every rejection sharpened me. Every sarcastic comment fueled a fire I didn't even know I had in me. So, when I stood in that backyard and heard the same old taunts, the same tired script they'd always read from, I didn't flinch. I didn't break. I just smiled. Because while they were mocking me, I was quietly building something they'd never understand. You don't always hear the sound of yourself breaking. Sometimes it happens so slowly, so gradually, you don't even realize you've hit bottom until you're lying on a mattress with busted springs in a half-empty apartment that smells like old takeout and defeat, staring at a cracked ceiling and wondering how the hell you ended up there. That was me, 3 years ago, in a place so low it didn't even feel like rock bottom. It felt like the cold, damp crawl space beneath it. I was juggling 3 jobs at the time. One as a waitress in a greasy diner where the manager called me sweetheart, in that way that made my skin crawl. One as a part-time grocery store clerk where customers treated me like wallpaper. And one doing data entry at night for a temp agency that never bothered to learn my name. I worked until my feet felt like raw meat and my back screamed for mercy. I had blisters on my hands and bags under my eyes, But not once did I stop grinding, even when everything else in my life started falling apart. The worst part wasn't the exhaustion, though. It was coming home one night to find my boyfriend, if you could even call him that anymore, packing his things in silence, like I was the inconvenience he couldn't wait to leave behind. No goodbye, no explanation, just a shrug and a muttered, "This isn't working." As if he was canceling a subscription and not walking out of a life we were supposed to be building together. A week later, my landlord gave me the final push over the edge. Rent was overdue, and there was no grace left in his tone when he said I had to be out by Friday. I didn't even cry. I was too tired to cry. I just stood there in my work uniform, holding a plastic grocery bag full of discount instant noodles, and nodded like that was just one more punch I was supposed to take without flinching. But funny how the universe works. Sometimes when you're crawling through the filth, you find something that changes everything, something sharp, something bright. I found mine sitting in the corner booth of a rundown coffee shop, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of burnt espresso, trying to figure out where I was going to sleep that night. That's when Ava walked in. She wasn't some glamorous savior riding in on a white horse. She looked just as worn down as I did, hair pulled into a messy bun, laptop tucked under her arm, dark circles under her eyes that mirrored my own. But there was something in her, a fire, a flicker, a sense that she was hanging by a thread too, but somehow still daring the world to cut it. We struck up a conversation over a shared power outlet and a mutual frustration with life. She was freelancing, scraping by, trying to launch a side hustle that wasn't going anywhere fast. I told her about my jobs, my eviction, my general spiral into chaos. We laughed, bitter and exhausted, and something clicked between us, not just a connection, but an idea. It started as a joke, really. What if we built something better than this? And the more we talked, the less it felt like a joke and more like a lifeline. That night, we sat in that booth until the lights dimmed and the staff started stacking chairs. We sketched out ideas on napkins, drafted plans in the margins of old notebooks, and dared to imagine that maybe, just maybe, we could do something different. The days that followed were brutal, early mornings, late nights, meals that consisted mostly of instant ramen and dollar store crackers. We worked out of libraries, borrowed Wi-Fi from cafes, and pitched to anyone who would listen. We failed. God, did we fail over and over again. But we kept going, kept tweaking, kept grinding. Every small win felt like gold. A single order. A new subscriber. A tiny deposit in a shared bank account that made us feel like we weren't completely insane for trying. Slowly, the momentum started to build. Our little side hustle grew teeth. Clients came back. Referrals trickled in. People started noticing. And through all of it, I kept my mouth shut when it came to my family. I didn't tell them a damn thing. Not about the long nights. Not about the small victories. Not about the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that I was building something real. Because I wanted them to keep laughing. I wanted them to keep their smug little smiles, their condescending remarks, their certainty that I was nothing more than a screw-up with nothing to show for herself. I wanted them comfortable in their mockery, so when the moment came, it would hit them like a freight train. And then one day it happened. A meeting that turned into a partnership. A handshake that turned into a contract. A number on a check so high it made Ava and I sit in stunned silence for 10 whole minutes. We had made it. Not overnight, not by luck, but by sweat and grit and refusing to die quietly. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, now a much nicer one, with real furniture and working appliances, and clicked purchase on something I never thought I'd own. It wasn't just a gift to myself. It was a symbol, a weapon, because I bought something I knew they'd never believe. By the time I made my second round through the backyard, the reunion had settled into its usual rhythm, a predictable cocktail of shallow conversations, overcooked burgers, plastic smiles, and stories that had been told so many times even the punchlines were tired. The kids were running wild around the swing set. The uncles were gathered near the grill pretending to know more about meat than the guy actually cooking it, and the aunts were lined up in lawn chairs, fanning themselves and swapping gossip with the same practiced tone they used to swap recipes. Everything felt rehearsed, like they had all slipped into their roles from memory without even thinking. And of course, none of those roles included me as anything more than the awkward background extra with no impressive lines to deliver. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, nodding here and there, sipping on my water bottle like it was champagne, pretending I didn't notice the glances thrown my way or the way the conversation volume always dipped when I passed too close. I'd expected this, of course. This was my family's brand of affection, disguised criticism, carefully veiled pity, and an ever-present hum of superiority humming beneath every word they spoke. At one of the tables near the patio, Emily had taken center stage again, laughing a little too loudly at one of her own jokes, her voice ringing through the backyard like a bell no one asked to hear. She was draped in some designer label I couldn't care to recognize, her heels digging into the soft grass, clearly chosen more for appearance than comfort. I watched her as she flipped her hair back, flashing her overly whitened smile to the circle of admirers she had gathered like moths around her ego. When she saw me walking by, her eyes lit up, not from warmth, not from any familial affection, but from that same smug delight she always reserved for moments she could publicly flex her imagined superiority. "Hey," she called out, just loud enough for everyone around her to hear. "How's that little job of yours going? Still doing, what was it, spreadsheets or emails or something?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm so thick it could have been bottled and sold as a condiment. I didn't stop walking. I just turned my head, smiled, and said nothing. The thing about power, real power, is that you don't need to announce it. You don't need to defend it. You just let it sit quietly beside you while others talk themselves into corners trying to prove they're above you. Behind her, my mother gave a familiar chuckle, the same dry, unimpressed sound I'd heard since I was old enough to be compared. "She's always been so modest," she said to no one in particular, swirling the ice in her drink as if that little detail was the most interesting thing in the world. We knew early on she wasn't going to be the star of the family, but at least she tries. There was a time when those words would have broken something inside me, made me feel small, made me question my worth and beg for approval that never came. But not today. Today I smiled wider, nodded gently, and kept moving toward the table with the fruit tray, like none of their words carried weight anymore. Because the truth was, they didn't. Not even a little. I glanced at my phone, almost too casually, and saw the notification light blink twice. A message had come through, simple and short, but it was the one I'd been waiting for. I opened it slowly, dragging out the moment like the first notes of a song only I knew the lyrics to. Just 4 words again, but they were louder than anything said at that reunion so far. "We're here. You ready?" I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned toward the edge of the backyard, just in time to see the sleek black car pulling into the driveway. Heads began to turn, eyebrows lifting, conversations pausing mid-sentence. The kind of vehicle you don't see at barbecues like this. The kind of presence that demands attention before a single word is even spoken. The driver stepped out first, opening the back door with mechanical precision, and out stepped Ava, flawless, confident, dressed in understated elegance that made Emily's designer dress look like a clearance rack find. She didn't look around nervously or search for approval. She walked with purpose, each step cutting through the tension like a blade. In her hand, she held the sleek silver key fob, turning it casually between her fingers like a magician about to pull off the final trick in a long, carefully orchestrated show. When she reached me, she didn't say hello or offer small talk. She just smiled that slow, wicked smile of hers and held up the keys between us. "You ready to show them the new private jet?" she asked, loud enough for the entire patio to hear, her voice slicing through the backyard air like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute, jaws dropping, drinks halfway to mouths, conversations cut mid-laugh. Someone near the grill dropped a glass, the shatter echoing louder than the gasps. I didn't look at Emily, but I could feel her staring, feel the weight of her confusion, her disbelief. The desperate calculations running behind her perfect smile as she tried to reconcile the woman she thought I was with the woman standing in front of her now. And still, I said nothing. I just smiled, nodded, and turned toward the gate. The show had only just begun. It never fails to amaze me how quickly people can pivot when they think there's something in it for them. How fast dismissive smirks transform into sugary smiles and backhanded comments morph into syrupy compliments once you've displayed even the faintest whiff of success. One moment you're the family disappointment who never quite figured life out, and the next you're suddenly fascinating, mysterious, impressive, worth sitting beside instead of whispering about from across the yard. That's exactly what happened the moment Ava held up those jet keys and cracked open the illusion they'd all built around me for years. The silence didn't last long. At first, it was just a few awkward glances exchanged behind cocktail napkins and plastic tumblers, the kind of twitchy, uncertain expressions people wear when they realize they may have seriously underestimated the person they've spent years ridiculing. Then the questions began, tentative at first, wrapped in thin layers of feigned curiosity, like they were trying not to choke on their pride while acting interested in the life they'd never bothered asking about before. Emily, of course, was the first to slither over, still holding that smile she probably rehearsed in the mirror for networking events. She perched herself on the edge of the lawn chair beside me, crossing her legs just so, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against her cup, pretending like we'd always been close cousins who shared secrets over wine and laughed about life's little surprises. "So," she said, her voice thick with forced warmth, "what is it you're doing now, exactly?" "I mean, I had no idea that you'd gotten into something so exciting." I turned my head slowly, met her eyes with a calm smile, and gave her the kind of look people reserve for strangers at elevators, neutral, polite, and utterly indifferent. "Oh," I said, shrugging slightly, "it's just a passion project. Nothing big." I let the words hang in the air, knowing full well they'd drive her absolutely insane. Behind her, my mother approached, and for the first time in years, her smile didn't have a trace of condescension in it. It was tight and awkward, like it was being forced out from somewhere behind her disappointment and confusion. "You know," she said, reaching out to touch my arm in a rare gesture of affection, "I always knew you had something special in you. You've just always done things differently, that's all." The same woman who once told me I was wasting my life and embarrassing the family now wanted to rewrite the narrative in real time, hoping no one would notice her about-face. I just nodded, keeping my tone light, keeping my posture relaxed, because I didn't come here to prove anything. I came to witness the shift, to watch their carefully constructed assumptions fall apart quietly, piece by piece, with no shouting, no declarations, no angry monologues. Just presence. Just reality. Just undeniable truth standing calmly in front of them while they struggled to make sense of it. Still, I showed them just enough to fuel their curiosity. A few photos on my phone, nothing over the top, nothing dramatic. A picture of Ava and me standing beside the private jet, casually dressed and laughing, as if we'd just stepped off a commuter train and not a luxury aircraft. I let Emily catch a glimpse of the Forbes feature we'd been included in last month, the one with the headline that mentioned our company name and called it one of the fastest-growing startups of the year. Their reactions were everything I expected, eyes widening, mouths opening slightly, glances exchanged like they were suddenly trying to calculate how far behind they'd fallen. But I didn't feed it. I didn't offer grand explanations or overblown details. I let the silence do the heavy lifting, let their minds fill in the blanks with wild speculation and whispered envy. And still, I didn't explain everything. I kept most of it close to my chest, not out of spite, not out of pettiness, but because I didn't owe them anything. Not after all those years of unanswered phone calls, of being told my ideas were foolish, of watching their eyes glaze over whenever I spoke about something that didn't fit neatly into their narrow definition of success. I remembered every birthday they skipped, every family dinner where my achievements were ignored in favor of Emily's latest promotion, every time my mother changed the subject when I tried to talk about what I was building. I remembered calling her after landing our first major client and hearing her pause before saying, "That's nice, honey, but do you think it's stable enough to be a real job?" I remembered the way my aunt once laughed and said I should have married rich instead of chasing dreams. I remembered everything. Now, here they were hanging on my every word, eyes wide, nodding along like they'd believed in me all along. And maybe, in some twisted way, they thought this was their redemption arc too, that by showing interest now, by pretending to care, they could rewrite the past and pretend the years of condescension never happened. But I didn't come here for validation. I didn't come here to rub anything in their faces. I came because I wanted them to really see, who I was when they weren't looking, when they were too busy mocking me to imagine I could become something more than a joke. Still, there was one more thing they didn't know. One last truth I hadn't shared yet. And I could feel it rising in my chest, just beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to drop. Because I didn't come here just to show off. I came to tell the truth. And I saved the best for last. The thing is, people always think it's the flash that does it, the car pulling up at the perfect moment, the jet keys catching the sunlight just right, the article in a magazine they never imagined I'd be mentioned in. They think it's the symbols, the shiny objects, the surface-level proof that finally shuts everyone up. But the truth is, that was never the secret. The jet was just a prop. A well-timed headline. A perfectly placed exclamation mark at the end of a sentence they didn't even bother to read. The real twist was never that I succeeded, it was that I did it in silence, right under their noses, while they were too busy laughing and gossiping and writing me off as the family footnote. The real twist was that the same business they once mocked behind my back now had a headquarters just 5 blocks from where my mother gets her hair done, and they didn't even know it until this very moment. I watched the realization dawn slowly across their faces as the conversation circled back to me for the 3rd or 4th time that hour. Someone had finally caught on. It was one of my cousin's husbands, a quiet guy who usually kept to himself at these things, who said it out loud, half joking, half curious. "Hey," he said, turning to me with a furrowed brow, "isn't that new building on Main Street yours? The one with the glass walls and all the tech stuff inside?" I didn't even need to answer. Ava leaned forward slightly and smiled, just enough to confirm what no one had dared to assume until now. That building, those walls, that logo, those employees filing in and out each day, it all belonged to us. Our business. Our team. Our legacy. There was a beat of stunned silence, followed by the kind of awkward shuffling you only hear when people are suddenly forced to recalibrate everything they thought they knew about you. I caught my mother's expression out of the corner of my eye, half confusion, half disbelief, as if the universe had pulled the rug out from under her without warning. Then came the final blow, the one I hadn't planned, but couldn't have scripted better if I'd tried. My aunt leaned toward my mother, whispering something too low for anyone else to catch, but I saw her mouth the words clear as day. "Did you know your best friend Marla just applied for a receptionist job there last week?" I felt the heat rise in the air around us like the last seconds before a thunderstorm. My mother's eyes narrowed, her mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. I watched the reality sink in slow, sharp, impossible to ignore. The same company she once dismissed as a hobby, a waste of time, now had 100 employees, an operations center right in her own backyard, and a hiring list that included her own friend begging for entry-level work. I didn't gloat. I didn't brag. I didn't throw it in anyone's face. I just stood quietly and let the truth sit heavy in the silence, like smoke filling the room after a fire. And then, just like that, Ava and I stood up, brushing off our hands, done with the performance, done with the show. As we walked toward the gate, the noise behind us turned into static. People were murmuring, whispering, trying to piece everything together, trying to rewrite their roles in the story now that the plot twist had been revealed. But I didn't turn around. I didn't owe them a final glance or a smug goodbye or some dramatic one-liner to tie it all up. We stepped into the car, doors clicking shut behind us and the engine hummed to life. I stared out the window for a moment, watching the figures in the backyard shrink into silhouettes, still stuck in the same place, still tethered to the version of me they wanted to believe in. And maybe they'd stay there forever. Ava looked over at me with that knowing smile, the one she always wore when she knew my mind was spinning even though my face looked calm. "So," she said softly, "do you feel better now?" I exhaled slowly, eyes still on the road ahead. "I didn't need revenge," I said, more to myself than to her. "I just needed closure." A beat of silence passed between us, quiet and honest and heavier than I expected it to be. Then Ava glanced at me again, raising one brow slightly, voice low but sharp. You sure about that? I turned toward her, let a smirk pull at the corner of my mouth, the kind that comes from a place somewhere between victory and uncertainty. No, I said, not really. We laughed quietly, sincerely, and the sound filled the car like a release valve finally giving way after years of pressure. But as the road stretched out before us and the reunion faded into the rearview mirror, I pulled my phone from my bag, meaning only to check some emails or scroll through a few updates. But there it was, at the top of my notifications, an unread message from a name I hadn't seen in years. My father. The one who vanished when I was 14, the one who left a hole in the family that no one ever really talked about, except in vague sentences and unfinished thoughts. The subject line was simple, just 5 words, plain and sharp. I saw the news. Can we talk? I stared at it for a long moment, phone still in my hand, Ava watching me silently from the passenger seat. Outside the window, the world kept moving, cars passed, people hurried, life pressed forward. But for just a second, I sat still in a moment that felt like the beginning of something else entirely. And I didn't know if I'd open it. Not yet. Not today. But I knew one thing for sure, some stories don't end with revenge. Some just begin with truth.